I don't I don't know that in my context of the work that mapping was necessarily something that we wanted to take the time out to figure out.
Right.
I don't know that that was really a value, and I say this in all love and sincerity. I mean, it's a model of whiteness that doesn't necessarily fit into the social justice context or lens that I operate from.
Right. And this is one of my questions: is do those categories make sense?
Yes, definitely. And so and again, not even trying to wrestle with whether or not it makes sense. What makes sense is showing up. And so
Right.
it's this. It wasn't about either or outside of the fourth precinct when we occupied the North Minneapolis fourth precinct in response to the death of Jamar Clark, and it wasn't, you know, folks that came out were folks again that came to be present in whatever way. And so then because of the way that this model or whatever is set up, we were in some respects kind of moved to have to fit into these lenses of doing work with that. And in my experience with the two sides has been, it's the side of not having more of the religious kind of binary model and affiliation, and those who have kind of like the nons were the folks that just were ready to go.
Right.
And the nons weren't from kind of the descriptive type that we heard earlier from our keynote speaker as those who didn't necessarily have an identity. The nons were those who just said, I wasn't necessarily in affiliation with anything. My affiliation doesn't necessarily speak to my identity, but I'm showing up in this way, and had proved to be a, for lack of a better word, a more pliable group of folk to work with, because you didn't have to work through all of the systems that come with the other side. Well, we got to talk to our governing structure or whatever that is and run this by whatever, whereas our folks who were coming from spaces and places that didn't have that were just like, yo, let's go.
Okay.
Ready to go.
Yeah.
So.
And I've been engaged, especially in the work in the multi-faith anti-racism roundtable work, with congregations that either because of their denominational affiliation or just where their congregation is at, can't be LGBTQ affirming or accepting, but are deeply engaged in that conversation with themselves and struggling with it and looking to see how they can evolve on it. And Danny's point rings true to me as well. It's like, there are churches that are LGBTQ affirming, but aren't engaged in it at all. And so I see it as a truer test if they're willing to get in the mess about it. Does that make sense?
Okay. So another question that I wanted to ask the panelists is, so we talked a little bit tonight, we heard about the nuns being a lot more common, right? There's more of them, right? But there's also, nuns, some non-religious folks are organizing a lot more based on their religious identities. Do you see any emerging non-religious partners or coalitions or point persons or liaisons in your work?
Ray mentioned the day that is that the National Day of Prayer when they pray for us?
Well, no, they do a separate day for each of us, but they do a separate day for each of us, but it's associated with the same group that does the National Day of Prayer.
Well, anyway, the same day the National Day of Prayer happens, there's the Minnesota Atheists, I'm looking at Heather there, holds the National Day of Reason, and they invite legislators out there. I remember in my first term, I'm looking at former State Representative Phyllis Kahn, who's here. I should recognize her. Representative Kahn was a groundbreaker in her willingness to publicly address the Minnesota atheists with a big banner that says "Atheists" overhead at the time. And I remember I went and spoke my second term, I think maybe the second year of my first term, and I remember Representative Kahn said something like, based on the fact that Representative Freiberg is here speaking to you, that means I've been able to double the number of legislators who are actually willing to speak to you. And then a couple years, I think Ray maybe showed up the next year, and then we had a couple more after that. So I mean, I think we maybe had five or six this past year. So it's a slowly increasing number of legislators who are willing to show up. That wasn't really your question, though. Your question was about.
That's okay. I've done these community panels before. That's fine.
Yeah. So all right. Well, I've probably taken up my time. I'll just leave it at that.
No, if you want to answer, answer the question too. That's fine.
Well, I mean, they are willing to show up, and I looked at their agenda was supporting science-based policies, whether you're talking about a belief in global warming. I shouldn't even say a belief in global warming. An acknowledgement of the fact of global warming is maybe a more accurate way to say it. Or policies in favor of vaccines. I do think especially considering what a growing group it is and how we've heard about that they do have the potential to be a counterbalance to some of certainly what's in the leadership at the Minnesota legislature and the U.S. Congress.
I'm thinking about about this word called safety, and with like how we gather the information or the numbers or the stats that we share about folks that are showing up based upon affiliation, religious views, and so forth and so on. I think about what showing up has meant for my people in the history of this particular country. And I mean, I think enough of us know the history, or at least are familiar with some of the history, but just speeding up, and we can go back about 50 years to civil rights, and we see what happened when people who look like me and were affiliated with religious groups or organizations or whatever that represented social change lenses for our people, that was with repercussion. And so I'm always reticent about receiving stats that represent African Americans in this way, in this landscape and context, because of that, because of this repercussion that happens when we do state our feelings, when we do state how we feel, or not only how we feel, but when we do stand up for the injustices that come our way. And so there could be there's a strong social distrust for surveys. They came through with surveys in the form of vaccines that shot syphilis into my people. And so there's a strong social distrust that exists there. And so it's hard for me to trust the numbers on the one side. And on the other side, we have to really factor in these other complexities that exist there among these other groups that are counting, that matter, I should say.
Yeah, and I would say that I have not seen a ton of organizing on behalf of explicitly, like organizations that call themselves atheist, humanist, secular in that terminology, but I think that's the default there's sort of a default tone of that in most sort of lefty social justice organizations. In the ones that I think are the healthiest, there is an explicit acknowledgement of humanness that is robust and full and acknowledges that people have spiritual lives no matter how they identify religiously. I think a thing that I am wary of right now in terms of white millennials in particular who are identifying as nuns is how closely that correlates with American individualism and in the way that whiteness and white supremacy encourage people to dissociate from cultural and ancestral lineage. And I think the impact of that, of people leaving faith traditions that they have named, particularly those who have inherited a Protestant or Christian lineage, because it's very different than it is for Jews and other groups. I think the impact of that is that those folks who are not associated with religious organizations and are still sort of out there in the social justice world, is that there's not actually a whole lot of organizing that's happened because people are culturally and communitarially dissociated. They're disconnected. And so the powerful relationships that are needed for powerful organizing are not there. And so I look forward to the day when institutions that are trying to organize, in particular white millennials, are also tending to the spiritual needs outside of religious contexts of those people, because I think it will help my people to become better co-conspirators in trying to shift the world.
Other responses or? Okay. So, final question. When you think about looking ahead in your work, the challenges that you face in mobilizing and organizing and reaching the constituents that you want to reach and turning out people, getting them to show up, how much does this shift in landscape with more and more non-religious people, how much is that something that's on your radar screen? I mean, apart from the nights when you're here at a panel and we're talking about this, I'm trying to, I guess, to get a sense of perspective. Is there urgency around these set of issues? Is it background? Is it how much have you been thinking about this already?
My elder colleagues in church world are freaking out about the death of the church. I have absolutely no sense that the death of a brick and mortar membership organization with a particular denominational religious affiliation is going to lead to the crumbling of American society any more than it has already crumbled. I think that what needs to happen is that we have to figure out how to bring antiquated models of belonging and community building into ways that are reaching the current generation and beyond. So I think that there is a lot of conversation about what do we do about the nuns? And every couple of weeks there's an article that somebody writes about how to attract the young millennials to come into the churches. And I don't think that's ever going to work. I think what we're going to see is the creation of new forms of belonging and community building that don't resemble what has come before.
I was saying in my beginning work with the BLM chapter here, I can remember we did an action on MLK Day a few years ago in St. Paul. We shut down Snelling University, and it led into some other things. And it was at that particular action that I was asked to open up in prayer in a way that invited everyone to the table. And I'll never forget kind of just my own internal struggle about like the search for language, the search for temperament, the search for affect, because the reality is that we wanted the nuns to come out of the shadows, in a sense, for lack of better words. We wanted the nuns to know that we're in community with you, that your issues are our issues, are collectively together. And so it was during that time and at that particular action that I saw like the real value of such. And I caught backlash from some of my traditional faith folks who were like, yo, you didn't pray in the name of Jesus. What's wrong with you? Or whatever that was. But I also got a lot of great response from what I know to be the nuns, and saying thank you for the ways in which you just grounded the space in universal truths like love and hope and change, those kind of things that are present, and making sure that we have voice. And I'm still not fully aware or have all of the kind of knowledge I need to be able to be in community with that community, because I come from a lens that says that you're supposed to minister to the nuns. And it's been great for me as an individual and a faith leader to just share space in that.
That's great. You've been wanting to say something, perhaps?
I think as we move away from maybe the cultural or historical trauma that some religious traditions have caused the LGBTQ community, I think that community is also looking for ceremony and belonging and spiritual homes and ceremonies beyond marriage, ceremonies that mark important life events in a way that isn't dictated by a pre-existing tradition that they just sort of left. And I think to that point too, as people become unaffiliated or untethered or move away from religion, I think it's also important to examine how, even if people are leaving a Christian church, that Christian hegemony still exists in our culture. And so for queer people in our community who don't have a home to go to for Christmas is still a seasonal time that's hard for them. And I think that's the way a Christian hegemony shows up in that way.
Well, speaking for me personally, I don't know how representative I am of the legislature as a whole, which is odd since my title is state representative. My dad is an atheist. That's how he identifies. I feel like it's a group that's been marginalized to a large respect. So, I kind of try to think about that, to seek out opportunities, like whether it's this or speaking at the Day of Reason, just to acknowledge the group. As a whole, it's not always the most comfortable location. If you do identify as a non-religious person, I mean, they start every session at the Minnesota House of Representatives with a prayer. Sometimes it's kind of non-denominational, and
occasionally we get a poem.
yeah, but sometimes it's not, and it's very Christian. So, as a new legislator, I'm sure for many people it would be uncomfortable. People like, do I really want my first political battle to be trying to get rid of the prayer at the Minnesota House of Representatives? I mean, so there's all these things you have to consider as a
Kittens next, no kittens, yeah.
So, and I'm not even saying I do, but if you wanted to, there would be a potential political price you'd have to consider into that. Like, there's a guy on the city council where I live who they started doing the Pledge of Allegiance at city council meetings, and he decided he didn't want to participate. So, and he got quite a bit of, and I don't know that it was for religious reasons necessarily, but he got quite a bit of blowback for that. So, I mean, it's just trying to find opportunities for people to be involved in the system is certainly something I try to do anyway.
Yeah, I mean, just quickly for me, I was shopping for vinyl records last month, and it happened to be on Vinyl Church Night, which I began to freak out a little bit. I can't continue shopping. But then what it was a bunch of people that were getting together, and they had a topic, and they talked about it, and there's a piece of music associated with it, and there was nothing about God about it, but it was that notion of where people could come together and have this experience, which I believe is maybe not different than the people that go to the big arenas in the southern part of the United States. Both valuable to each other, to each of the people in a certain way. I think one is maybe more, I want to choose my word carefully. One is maybe more constructive long-term, and one is maybe more rewarding short-term. But can I call you Mike here? We're not at the Capitol, yeah. To Mike's point, the Capitol is a really, really weird place.
We're gonna end on that note.
Okay,
We're gonna
great.
end on that note. Okay.
Yep.
I hear what he's gonna say next. Yeah. I want to first, though, take a moment to thank both the panelists. Really appreciate your participation tonight. I want to thank Phil and Jackie and Evan for a great first panel, and the organizers and everyone who put this together. It's been a really smart and interesting conversation. I was asked to leave you with just a few concluding remarks, and it looks like a lot, but it's really big print because I'm old, so trust me, this won't take very long. My first point that I wanted to leave you with tonight, or the first thought I wanted to leave you with tonight is get used to it. The nuns are here to stay. This is not a blip. We are in the midst of a long-term historic demographic shift away from a society in which the vast majority of people not only believe in God, but embrace some kind of particular historic religious identity and are involved with the traditional religious institution in some way, and toward a society where a large plurality and perhaps an emerging small majority are non-religious, broadly speaking, in various interpretations of what that means. It's not a blip, it's a trend. And when the trend has finished trending, it will result in a reconfigured landscape, I think even more so than where we are today. And so what are the things to keep in mind when we think about understanding these changes in the landscape that we are moving into? And first, I do want to uphold something that several people have mentioned tonight, is just the heterogeneity of the non-religious in the American religious landscape, non-religious landscape. Some of the nuns do engage with religion in really serious ways. If by religion we mean spirituality, we mean religious practices, some of them do affirm certain parts of their religious history and identity. So there are a fair number of people who don't engage with religious organizations, but they affirm many religious practices, some religious beliefs. So that's part of the landscape. There are others who are avowedly secular and embrace both personal non-religion and really have a strong preference for a secular public sphere. Some of the nuns are joiners, right? They join stuff. They join networks. They create networks, whether that's non-religious organizations or working in and through certain religious organizations or social justice organizations. Some of them really care about identity building, community building, activism. Others really are kind of nothing in particular. They don't affiliate on a whole range of, with a range of groups or movements. They just tend not to affiliate in general. So one of the challenges, I think, for thinking about civic involvement of the non-religious is in forefronting this diversity and really thinking through these different dimensions, joiners versus non-joiners, the level of comfort with or familiarity with or embrace of religion among the non-religious. And also something that we didn't talk about tonight, but what I think is fascinating, what do we know about the emerging visions of the public good among non-religious people? What are they trying to accomplish? What visions of the public good or the good society motivate them to get involved in the first place when they do get involved in civic engagement? I think another challenge is in keeping in mind that the insights that we generate today will have to be revised in 10 years, in 20 years, in 30 years. I think we really are in the middle of a transition, not at the end of it. People who are in high school now, and in 10 years, they'll be in their late 20s. People who are in college now will be in their early 30s in 10 years. And those generations have grown up taking a whole different set of things for granted about religious connection, about religious belief, religious identity, civic life, how they organize, what organizations they turn to if they do want to get involved. And I don't think we know where those folks are going yet. So I think it's also important for us as we develop this vocabulary for trying to understand the shifting landscape now, to understand that our terms have to be, to some extent, provisional. We're not yet where we are going to be going, and we need to keep that openness in mind. For me, as a sociologist, and primarily I have studied contemporary American religious organizations and religious persons, I think this is, for me, it's a really exciting time. There's a lot of intellectual energy being generated by the study of non-religion, and this scholarship on non-religion is also changing and challenging what we thought we knew about organized religion in the United States. So it's a very exciting time. People who understand civic life and who care about civic life and civic engagement, for all of us, I think there's a really exciting opportunity here, both to reanalyze and rethink our older assumptions about religion's role in the public sphere, and also to develop new insights into the civic engagement and political involvement of the non-religious. I think conversations like the one we have had tonight here are a great place to start, and I would like to thank all of you for being part of it.